It's time to turn to writers again on Tree Lady Talks, and today Sharon is talking to a man who's a forester, scientist, and also on the New York Times bestsellers list, which is a pretty rare combination, I think.
If you're feeling rotten, maybe you've forgotten to listen to a Tree Lady talk.
His new book is called The Heartbeat of Trees, and in it, amongst other things, he describes how he identified the fact that trees have a heartbeat.
This book follows on from two other books of his I've absolutely loved, The Hidden Life of Trees and The Secret Network of Nature. Peter is such a good writer. He really captures the imagination of anybody who reads this book. It's not just for us tree folk, and it was a privilege to speak to him. This is Tree Lady Talks, and I'm Sharon Durdant-Hollenby. All music and production is by Noel Durdant-Hollenby. And all views expressed by me or the interviewees are entirely personal.
So let's sit back and enjoy Sharon speaking to Peter Wohlleben.
Hello, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Sharon. Nice to be on your show.
Peter, for those who don't know, and I can't imagine there are many, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
I'm a forester mainly, although many people know me as an author, but I'm a forester. I'm an environmentalist. I run a forest academy in the western parts of Germany to educate children or forest owners or just interested people interested in trees.
And you've written this great book, The Heartbeat of Trees, your latest book, which I've absolutely loved. And what I love about your writing, it's interesting for me as a professional, but it really will capture the imagination of the layman. You're an international bestseller, so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
But it got me thinking about some of the themes in the book about our own superpowers. You start off talking about, have we forgotten how to have our own superpowers? And I wondered, are our senses dulled by the relative ease of survival nowadays? But with climate change and biodiversity loss, is it time to sharpen those senses?
Hopefully not. That shouldn't be the reason, but it's good to know that we are still strong with our senses. What I love more is that people discover their hidden senses, which are still there, and use them to connect better to nature. Because then we are better able to protect it, and then we don't need our senses for the worst case scenario. Many people think that our senses are degenerated, that we are bad in everything, but just our mind tops every other species, and that's the reason why we are destroying this lovely planet. But our senses are still intact, but we just don't use them in everyday life. For example, our nose. We often think that our nose is worse than the nose of the dog, and that's true when it concerning meat or deer or birds. In fruits, for example, we are much better because fruits are not dogs are not interested in fruits, but fruits are very important for us, so we can smell. Even the trek, a scientist in Stockholm did it with his students, made treks on the grass. And after, 30 minutes or so, the students had to smell the trek and where it goes. And in this smell, students were better than dogs. So our senses are very good for our concerns.
How interesting. We do tend to flood them with artificial scents as well. And I was interested to read that our gut helps us taste and smell. Yeah,
our guts are in many senses very, very interesting. And they can smell, and that's the reason why all those artificial stuff and 10,000s of smells and tastes running through our guts, and the gut is interacting with our brain, as we know, the gut brain. But which is even more interesting, that in our gut there are thousands of bacteria species communicating with our brain. And there are some scientists who says that the development of our nerve system through evolution was at first reason for the communication from the bacteria to our brain. So, because, for example, the bacteria are producing hormones. When you don't feel well, perhaps that are the bacteria in your guts which say, no, please don't do this, and please calm down and let us do our job. So our body is a complete ecosystem.
And one we've sort of neglected in a way, we're being very clean. Generally, a bit of healthy dirt, good forest soil, somehow getting into our gut biome is really how we're meant to live, isn't it? I wondered also, talking about our sixth sense.
That is, for example, when you think there's someone behind you without having seen this person or heard, and when you turn, there is a person. That means that we have many senses which are dealing with our environment, and in everyday life, we are just trusting our eyes or perhaps our ears. And but we can realize the little wind a person causes, or a little difference in temperature. And for example, we also have a body sense, and no one thinks about that we know where our body ends and why it should be straight up. That is a special sense, the body sense, which is not very often discussed, but which is very, very important in every second, not to get damaged and wounded. And the sixth sense, I think we could talk about many senses more that we have, but it's very important to realize things which we don't get aware of.
When we walk in a forest, what happens to all of our senses, including the sixth sense, and why is it good for us?
This senses get sharpened, but just as long as you be aware of them. For example, what I really love to do with children is letting them taste the difference between different tree species. For children, it's boring when you tell them, this beech tree, this is an oak tree, and they have different leaf shapes. That's okay to tell them, but when it's the only thing you do with them, they say, "Oh, forests are boring." But when you, for example, what we do, let them taste the leaves, and then afterwards they have to close their eyes, and then we feed them with different leaves, and they shall say which species it is, and they are very good in this, and that's a lot of fun. And by the way, you realize that, for example, an oak trees have more bitter leaves, and beech trees more sour leaves, and birch tree is something in between. Or the older the leaves get, the worse they taste, and the harder they become, a little bit more like wood. And so this is just one example that you can discover forest. What I love to do is with adults is to ask after 1 hour or so, do you know how the forests smell? And then they take a deep breath through the nose. But without that, they couldn't tell how the forests smell. And then they say, for example, when you're walking under the canopy of conifer forest, of course, you know that it smells a little bit like a holiday in Spain.
Yes.
Very aromatic. And that is stress communication. And that I have to say, I love that smell. Although I know that the trees are a little bit stressed. For example, here around our old forester house, there are Douglas firs, which are not common to Germany, and which is not okay for nature, but they are wonderful garden trees, of course. And when it's getting warm, as it is getting now, we had also a lot of rain in the last weeks. Now the sun is out. And now we can smell the Douglas fir. And that's, for me, the smell of summer.
I know that as we walk through the forest, the trees release chemicals which are very purifying. Perhaps you could expand more on that a little bit.
That's a research. I think it's very old, around about 80 years or so, from Russia, where scientists found out that trees, and in this case pine trees, they gas out chemicals to clean the air from bacteria and fungi. Well, we know also that trees are communicating with many gases, and that we are breathing them in, and our human system is reacting. Our blood pressure sinks. I've tested that with a TV host in Cologne, and I hope that this worked because the cameras were on.
Well, you can feel it yourself, can't you? Because I mean, I live in the countryside, and I can be aware of my blood pressure changing because I have to, actually, for health reasons. And when I'm in the city and the cars are rushing by, which I was in London yesterday, I was feeling quite stressed, and I just imagined being back home and looking at the view and looking at trees and walking through the wood nearby. And actually, I do lie down on the floor in the wood and look up at the trees and can feel my blood pressure going down. And that's been carried out many times, hasn't it, as an experiment. And it's just so good for us. And people are really beginning to latch onto it, aren't they?
Yeah, and our consciousness says when this happens, when blood pressure sinks, it's a nice place here, and we are relaxing. But I love the idea that it's the other way around. When you're among your trees, your garden, that's your natural habitat. And when you go into a city, your blood pressure rises. We say, when you go out in the forest, blood pressure sinks. No, that's normal blood pressure. It rises when you're in the city or in the room or wheresoever. So it's not a real danger, but it's better to be outside.
Here in the UK, it's being increasingly prescribed, either informally or formally by GPs here. I wonder, actually, this is just being a bit off the wall, but I wonder if there's a danger in creating too much of a commercial experience of forest bathing. So everything has to be a commodity, doesn't it, unfortunately?
First time I read about that, I thought, okay, why shouldn't it be possible to go into a forest without being guided and without paying for it? Because everyone knows how it is possible to relax. And but I think meanwhile, it's a good idea to have forest bathing and to have forest bathing trainers, because when we go into the forest, we always have a plan. We make a schedule. We say, okay, let's start at 9 a.m. At noon, we are in this little restaurant out there. And then afterwards at 5 p.m., we are back at the cars, and we should have made 10 miles or whatsoever. And that's also one of the first questions when you talk with friends about it. How many miles you made? And it's always a little pressure. It's always a schedule. It's not relaxing. And when someone guides you and say, okay, lay under a tree for half an hour, just look up into the sky and see the leaves shaking in the wind, then you say, okay, he or she said it, so I will do it. And then you relax. So, of course, everyone can do it on oneself, but no, usually we don't allow ourselves to relax in the forest.
I think that perhaps for you and I who work in this field, we're used to being in a forest. We feel very comfortable. We don't feel afraid. But actually for people who it hasn't been their normal experience, and their normal experience of exercising is how many steps have I done on my phone today? How many calories have I burnt? There is this culture now of achieving goals. And in a way, forest bathing is to diminish the idea of achieving goals. It's about being in the moment and awakening our senses and all of our senses. Who knows how many we really have? Certainly more than 7, I'm quite sure. So that's interesting. I mean, I welcome the movement. I was just being a bit cheeky, thinking, is it another money-making thing? But actually, no.
Yeah.
One of the things you talk about in your book as well, which is pure science, but hasn't been really explored that much before to my knowledge, is the electrical impulses. Obviously, we have electricity and trees have electricity. And explain a bit about how that works and why we don't get a big shock when we hug a tree.
It's about the tension of the air. A tree is grounded, so it has always the tension zero volt. And But the air, higher it is, for example, the first meter, you have 200 volts, and 2 meters, it's a little bit less than 400 volts. It's becoming less and less, but in summed up, it's in the height of a big oak, and in the highest branches, you have to the ground, there's a difference of tension around about 2000 volt, depending on the weather. So there is a big tension difference, but when we stand on the ground, we are also grounded. So if you hug a tree, there is zero tension concerning this circumstance. But insects flying through the air have always the same tension of the air where they're flying in. And so, for example, bees, when they touch the flower, the bee has a higher load than the flower. And then the flower gets also a higher load. Perhaps it's a little shock. I don't know if bees gets a little stroke when they touch a flower. But
well, that's why their hair's on end. Yeah. Otherwise, they'd have smooth hair, wouldn't they?
Yeah. But the next bee knows before sitting down that there just shortly has been another bee, so they fly to the next flower. So. I love the idea of the little spiders spinning their thread in autumn to fly away. And they do it not in windy weathers. Usually I would think, okay, they do it in windy weather, so they can fly better away. But when they spin the little thread, this little thread will come to branches and wouldn't go straight away from the tree. So those little spiders do it just when there is a big tension difference from the air to the tree, and they can feel it with the little hairs on their back. And when the tension difference is high enough, then they shoot out their thread and fly away. So there is a lot about tension, but I think we as humans are not sensitive enough. We know that we can feel tension differences when we, for example, touch in dry weather a car and getting a little shock. Or plastic furnitures in summertime outside, then sometimes you get a little shock, or even when you shake hands, it makes a little sound and hurts a little bit. But that are much higher tension differences, I think more than 10,000 of volts. So the 2000 volt difference, I think we are not sensitive enough, but I wrote this in the book. I would love to test it with persons like you with longer hair than I have, because when you climb up a tree, then you have always the same tension like a tree, zero, but the surrounding air has a much higher tension, and your hairs should go straight away, like you rub them with a balloon.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Apart from listeners know that I'm too scared to climb a tree. The title of the book is The Heartbeat of Trees. What do you think might be the heartbeat of trees?
Yeah, the research about this is still going on, but I read a scientific paper, and I was really, is it right to say, electrified? That would be the in this sense the best expression, because I read that 3 scientists from Finland, Austria, and Hungary were researching on the sleeping behavior of trees. And we know that many plants, perhaps all, have sleeping behaviors. For example, little daffodils or other flowers, they are closing their blossoms during nighttime. That is sleeping behavior. Sleeping behavior doesn't mean that they are dreaming, but they're behaving different in nighttime. Just to say, till now we don't know what human sleep really is. There are many explanations, but there's no final explanation what's going on at nighttime. So that doesn't mean that we are inactive. We are differently active, and that's exactly what trees are doing. They let hang their branches a little bit. Those researchers made laser scans during nighttime, in nights without wind, and they found out that birch trees let hang their branches around about 10 centimeters down, although the water pressure in the trunk is rising during night times.
Oh, that's what I was going to say. Is it due to the fact that they're not photosynthesizing because it's dark and they're not as turgid?
No. The water pressure, the trunk gets even a little thicker during nighttime because the water pressure just around about 0 point somewhat millimeters, but the pressure is rising, but the branches hang down. We don't know why. It's just observation. And by the way, they found out that the trunk is shrinking and expanding in the rhythm of 3 to 4 hours. And till now, we don't know how the water is coming up the stem from the roots to the crown. So that may be the first explanation that trees have something like a heartbeat. And that would match because trees are so slow. And many things have been overlooked by trees because they react so slow. And the heartbeat, with the rate of 1 beat within 3 to 4 hours, that would perfect match to the speed of trees.
And we all thought it was just transpirational pull that was forcing the water up from the roots to the leaves, but it's possibly a heartbeat.
It's possibly a heartbeat because the explanation with the transpiration that can be very often read in books or in the internet. But the highest water pressure is before the leaves come out in spring. And the transpiration thing would just work with leaves transpirating, of course. And at the highest pressure, you can judge it yourself. For example, when you want to gain maple sap, and for sugar, then you have to drill those holes to get the sap out in February or March. And afterwards, when the leaves comes out, the trunk gets drier in the inside. But before the leaves come out, you have the highest pressure. That's without transpiration. So it's a good explanation that there is something like you may say a biological pump. What else is a heart?
Yes, that's right. I like using that sort of language. Do you think it's time to stop the ranking of nature with man at the top and all nature underneath in a scale? Or is it time just to put bees and fungi at the top where they belong?
I would love to see the other species beneath us, not higher, not lower. They are different, of course. They don't write books. They don't make podcasts. They have other abilities which are cool for them, perhaps not for us. I've talked with a philosopher, Emmanuel Kocher, and he said, if we have a ranking, then plants have to rank the highest, and not humans, because we are depending on plants. And when we say, okay, humans first, then higher animals, lower animals, higher plants, lower plants. So plants are in the basement of this pyramid, and but without plants, no life would happen on this planet, and so we are depending on plants. And it's a question for you: what is the main difference between animals and plants? The main difference. There are many differences.
The main difference is plants can't move, animals can move.
But there are many animals which can't move. For example, corals or sponges or many. The biggest building on Earth are not man-made. They are made by corals, Great Barrier Reef, for example. No, that's not the main difference. And I love this answer because many people deal every day with the difference. For example, on dealing on food, meat, vegetarian. I'm a vegetarian, but just to say that.
Well, I mean, it again, I can't say that plants rely on photosynthesis because we have insectivorous plants.
Yeah.
So I can't say that.
But it's in general, it's the main difference that plants are able. You're completely right. There are plants which are, I don't know the English expression, but which are depending on other plants. Let's say
parasitic. We have parasitic plants,
exactly,
and we have insectivorous plants. I actually think fungi are incredibly fascinating, and I think that we wouldn't have plants without fungi, or what came first.
I also read about this, that the first living beings on land were fungi, but it's hard to explain because fungi are not able to produce their own food, so they also need plants. I don't know how this works, but I think really the main point is that most plants can produce their own food. And when it comes to fungi, we see that until the 1960s, fungi were regarded as plants. But they are constructed like insects with chitin in their cells. They are not able to produce their own food. They are more animals than plants. But biologists wouldn't like to sort fungi to animals. So they say, okay, we have plants, we have fungi, we have animals. And this shows that this hard ranking doesn't make any sense, because I think the reason why we understand plants so bad is that we rank them so low. And for many people, trees, plants are not much more than green stones.
There is an awakening, though, isn't there, I think, amongst many people, and, perhaps a new renaissance in how we think about nature and the natural world, which is perhaps very fanciful of me, but it does seem to be a real upsurge. And I think the pandemic has helped that in some way, that people have been almost forced to look outside in their immediate environment and notice the small things that before they simply were too busy to do.
Hit the subscribe button to guarantee you don't miss an episode, and you can follow us on
Twitter at the Tree Lady 67,
Instagram, Tree Lady Talks,
Facebook, Sharon Hosgood Associates,
or send an email to noel@treeladytalks.co.uk.
Going back to the pure science, there is an absolutely fascinating section in the book about a South American vine that mimics its host. The scientific thinking was that there was some kind of chemical reaction, chemical communication going on between host and this vine. But what did the scientists find?
They constructed an artificial plant made of plastics, and there couldn't be any smell, any gases, any whatsoever, and with artificial plastic leaves. And this plant also made its leaf shaped after this plastic leaves. It's a reaction from the plant. It wouldn't like to be fed by animals, eaten by animals, and so it tries to hide behind this forms. But the main point is the only explanation which is left, that this plant is able to see. And we see in many leaves of other plants. It's just one example, and the research is still going on. But we see in many plants, the first layer of a leaf are lenses, or lenses-like cells. And the question is, when you just want to make photosynthesis, why should you have an extra layer of clear lenses? Well, because lenses are not able to collect light, but they are just able to bundle the light. So, and as you have binoculars, I have or glasses, and me too, and we know both that it's not very good, because a little bit of the light is always reflected, and those lenses get dirty and whatsoever. It's not a pleasure every day to wear glasses at last with masks. Glasses are not good. Lenses are not good when you just want to collect light and to make photosynthesis. So the question is, what do those lenses in the first layer of leaves? And there's research going on, for example, here from the University of Bonn, because there's a possibility that the trees are able to see in reality like many other plants. And now you could say, for what reason? Trees are not able to move away. They are so slow, but that is exactly the explanation. When we are confronted with a danger, our main strategy is to walk away. So we don't have to get aware very early. It's enough when we see a danger, let's say 1 or 2 minutes in advance. That should be enough. For a tree, because it reacts so slow, it would be great if you could see, for example, an approaching deer or a wild boar or whatsoever endangering its leaves. So it can prepare much earlier in advance. It's not proven so far, but I like the idea when you're when you're out in the forest, for example, that's the bad news, and go behind a tree for certain things, you are watched.
We've learnt in recent years that trees communicate through their root system, through the mycorrhiza fungi, that when a leaf is munched on an oak tree, it stimulates the oak tree, for example, to release tannin, which is expensive for the tree. The tree does not turn on its expensive energy-consuming chemicals all the time. And so the common thought is, and it may still be the case, that that's in response to injury of leaf that triggers that chemical. But could it also be a response to these millions of eyes on the tree to seeing caterpillars or particular pests going to the tree?
That could be so, but until now, no one researched it. So that would be an interesting research to find out if it is so. If not, it's also okay. But if it is the case, that would be. I would love the idea that when you go through the forest, you billions of eyes are watching you. But what we know is that many plants are able to hear the munching of caterpillars on neighboring plants. And what we also know is that's research from Switzerland, that plants are able to take care of their family members growing beneath them, and that they bring their leaves a little bit out of the sunlight so that the family members get enough sunlight, but just family members, and they are planted in different pots. So that means that there is no connection through the root system. So the plants have to recognize through the air and judge if a neighboring plant is a family member. That's research from I think it's ETH Zurich. They are known that they are not esoteric people.
That's interesting. So it could be that the family member sapling is giving off the chemicals which are felt through the root system or the stomata of the leaves, or it could be that the tree can see it.
The plants in this laboratory, of course, not trees because they are too big for a laboratory, but no, they found it by genetic manipulation that it's the light. That's the different parts of red and green and blue light, which is reflected by leaves. And this reflection is different, individually different, and the neighboring plant can judge, this light is coming from a family member. It's not a smell, it's by light. So we are, again, in the range of the ability of seeing. And I don't know if they, perhaps it's not seeing in the way we do it, with a sharp picture. But perhaps for plants it's not necessary. And on the other hand, we don't know. Perhaps they see a sharp picture.
And what's fascinating about that, if trees can see and hear, to some extent, where are they processing that information? It implies a consciousness, it implies a decision-making process, or maybe it's instinct. Where might the tree's brains be, if at all?
I think we have more and more hard facts that the root system is a similar thing to our brain. Perhaps not, of course, not the same construction, but it doesn't have to be a central protein spot, as we know from octopus, for example, which is a very intelligent animal and has many parts of its brain in its arms. We know, for example, by research, that the decision to close all those little, I don't know how it's called in English, stomata in the leaves, that signal comes from the roots. The roots are is the main part where the signaling goes through the trunk up to the leaves and is controlling what the tree is doing. So I'm convinced that the main part of the tree is the root system. And we know that in the root tips, there are brain-like structures. Already Charles Darwin postulated that the root tips are similar to earthworm's brain. In the moment, there's ongoing research at the University of Bonn, which we support, concerning a single molecule for signaling, which is used in root tips and in our brain. It's the same molecule. So we have many identical mechanisms. Of course, a plant has no neural system. It's different, and therefore it's much slower because nerves are much faster. I think around about 1,000 or 2,000 times faster than the electrical transport from cell to cell. But that doesn't mean that it's not working in a similar way. And some people say, you anthropomorphize things, and you wish that there are the same mechanisms going on. But trees are here since 300 million years. And we are here on this little planet since 300,000 years. And even if you count the ancestors, then we have perhaps 1, 2, 3 million years. But what is it against 300 million years? So the first inventors of these systems are trees or plants in general.
Your books are so easy to read for anybody who's got an interest in the natural world. I wonder if, when we're not afraid to use emotional language, that's really powerful in terms of environmental messaging. And when we only talk about things in a scientific realm, that it doesn't connect with people's hearts and affect the change.
That is what some scientists criticize, that the language is too emotional and not scientific language. But what is scientific language? As you said, it's without emotions. And we are working, I think, around about 90% on emotions. And language without emotions is an unhuman language. It's okay for scientists to compare things, 100% okay. But to tell people what's going on and to understand, you need emotions. Think about a novel without emotions.
Yes.
I think you wouldn't read it. Harry Potter without emotions wouldn't work. So, and that's exactly the difference. That means that what I'm telling are not fairy tales. That's science, but in a way we understand it, and that's exactly what I wanted. As you said, I'm not aiming at the brain. I'm aiming at the heart, and that's. And you mentioned instincts, which I love, because that's something we share with whole nature. Many animals, or all animals, are perfect in instincts as we are. Think of love, happiness, fear, whatsoever, that are the driver of our instincts. And we are especially good in our mind. We are really very intelligent, and there is no animal with a podcast. Or as I don't know, perhaps
well that we know of. I mean, I think some of the fungi have got a good thing going on underneath the ground. But yes, that we know of, that we understand with our limited imagination at this stage in history.
Exactly. They may have their own show, of course. Perhaps they call it podcast. I would love to hear that. But we have certain abilities which are really great. Perhaps they are too good, as we see now when we look into the environment. But as when it comes to instincts, then most beings are exactly on the same level, or more or less in the same range. And of course, trees are much more different than animals from us. So it's very hard to feel empathy with the tree, even more than with grass, for example. But I think it's very important to connect better with all those beings, to understand their needs and to understand why they are so good for us. They are much more important than just producing timber or shadow. Or
I spoke to Yvonne Lynch, who worked in Melbourne for the municipality, and each street tree had an email address. The idea was that the residents could report a tree defect that they spotted. What actually happened was that people were writing love letters to trees, that they did ascribe emotion towards these trees, that these trees have played an enormous part in people's life events, or, they were landmark trees. And you see this throughout the world. I think that there is a great feeling of emotional attachment towards some trees. And sometimes it may seem illogical from our scientific perspective. You write about the Sitka spruce in Sweden, about how the very trail to see that tree might be wearing out its roots, and that it's nothing much to look at, but it's about that connection. I love the way you write in the book, which we touched on this earlier, about taking time when we're walking through a forest. And really, you spoke about children and how they're natural at this. What do you think we could learn from being more like children, and how might this shape the management of our natural spaces?
I think children ask better questions. Some questions seems to be so crazy that we don't ask them. But children are not shy. They ask, for example, do the three children have parents, or maybe perhaps do they write emails? Which I don't know, because the Wood Wide Web, that's it's. I would say I imagine it a little bit more like a nerve system than an internet. But perhaps I would love the imagination that the trees are sharing something like emails. For example, a typical children question is when it comes to tree communication. We know, meanwhile, a lot of things when trees are attacked by bark beetles, for example, or by deers, or by or suffering from droughts. That are all bad things, and that is good to measure because you can reconstruct it for research. But perhaps trees are also, let's say, in epistrophics, talking about good news. And that's very hard to prove scientifically, but I love children's questions like that. Perhaps have a nice day. How are you? What will it smell? Because mostly there are smells in trees. I don't know.
Why shouldn't they experience joy? Well, there's a question. Moving on from, trees sharing happy emails, you write a lot, particularly in the last quarter of the book, about the sad loss of our ancient forests for timber. Tell us about what you've seen around the world in your trips to Poland and Canada, for example.
Perhaps I'll tell you a little story about the Indian hidden life of trees. The foreword was written by Pradeep Krishnan. That he wrote a foreword for the book and said that it's lovely to hear other descriptions of forest from a German forester, because German foresters destroyed Indian forest 150 years ago because the Britons brought forestry into the subcontinent. And at that time, there was only French or German organized forestry. And of course, British people didn't brought French foresters to India, but German foresters. And German foresters were also in North America, they were in Australia. And so most industrial forests, meanwhile, look the same. We have all over the same problems. We have damaged forests, we have instead second growth or plantations. We have the explanations when those weakened forests breaks down now because of climate change, that the real reason should be the bark beetle. We read, for example, from Canada, the lodgepole bark beetle, lodgepole pine bark beetle. It's a long word. But in reality, it's forestry which is destroying the forest. And I visited the Quaker First Nation in British Columbia. Their forest shall be destroyed. It's around about 500 square kilometers. I don't know what is in square miles, but it's big. And the Quaker people are just 22 people. So they suffer from forest industry in Poland, Białowieża, the last primeval European forest is going to be destroyed by the forest industry. And they say we just have to remove the bark beetle infested spruce trees, but that's not true because it's a protected forest. Next week, I will travel to Romania the last remaining beech tree forest in Europe, which were also common in Britain 1,000 years before. The last remaining forests there are clear cut for the timber industry, for cheap furniture. So it's all over the world the same. That sounds very, very sad. But all over there, I met people who engaged in fighting for the forest, but they're mostly on their own. And most people think, I'm the only one. And so I think, and that's my task, to connect them, to make networks, because there are so many people. As you say, many people love trees, and many people fight for their special tree. For example, in cities, when the trees should be removed for a new road, the people stand up and fight. Therefore, I love the idea that the tree has an individual email address, so it gets personalized. Which it is. Each tree is something special.
That's interesting. Sounds like you're going to be developing a new wood wide web of impassioned tree people around the world. But exactly. in a time of trying to reduce plastic and plastic waste, people are looking towards natural products, including wood. And there is a feeling that that's a good thing. But you're concerned about that.
Because we again reducing trees in this case as a carbon neutral material, and trees are not the carbon storage. That's something which exists just in our mind. Of course, they are storing carbon, but they are creating ecosystems. It's not a single tree; it's a community of trees, and trees hate the same things we do. They don't love it too hot. And I think in some parts of Britain, the summers are still cool. But in Germany, we had 3 very hot and very dry years, like in many parts of the world, like in North America or Australia and wherever. You're lucky that you're surrounded by an ocean. But in Germany, we don't have that case. So we look at trees, and trees like it cool, trees like a lot of rain, and so trees create their own climate, although the temperatures are rising. And so trees can help us cool down the climate. But when we reduce them to carbon storages, which are best stored in furnitures or in houses or in power plants replacing coal, then this wonderful social community is destroyed and burned for electricity. And many scientists say that burning timber is worse for the climate than burning coal. And it's okay to use timber. I love my wooden desk. I love a campfire, of course. I love my ukulele, which is constructed out of wood. That's okay to use wood. But when we try to fight climate change by using more wood just to fight climate change, that's nonsense. The best help trees can give us is cool down and give more rain.
And sequester carbon as well whilst they're growing.
Yeah, okay, you're right. But that's, I think we are on a tipping point. The Amazon rainforest, for example, is gassing out more carbon dioxide than taking up in the moment. And the Central European forests and Western European forests, for example, in Germany, we are losing most of the spruce plantations, and that is more than half of the German forest area within the next 10 years. That means that the forest there will gas out much more than they take up. So I think the carbon storage thing, trees are not responsible for what we are doing with the atmosphere. So we should reduce it on our own.
No, I think you're right. I think there's always a problem when we look at a very complex issue through a single lens. And I think, in the UK, it's a great thing that the UK government has made targets to plant 30,000 hectares of new woodland a year. There's a lot of discussion here in the UK about the right sort of woodland in the right sort of place and all the multiple benefits they can bring. Our next podcast is with a carbon market specialist in the UK, and that was absolutely fascinating about planting new woodlands to deliver the carbon sequestration. And I was actually really comforted by the holistic way that was being looked at in terms of ecosystem services, about creating a pleasant place to walk, for biodiversity. And equally, with a wonderful company, Ecos, in New Zealand, where they have a very holistic approach to carbon, the carbon market, and thinking about how is it impacting on indigenous communities? What are the socio-economic benefits and disadvantages? We need to learn at this tipping point in time that we can't just have a quick plaster saying this is a solution, this will solve everything. It's never like that. And if we've learnt something through your writing, it's inextricably complicated. I wonder, what would be your ideal way of managing a plantation for timber? What do you do in your forests that you are the forest manager of?
We are not planting plantations anymore. We are at the moment we are constructing a new form of forestry at universities, and I think in 2 years the first students will start their study of a new environmental friendly forestry, and that means that you are not planting forest, but you are healing the ecosystem and make it more resilient. And then you can look and all things, all parameters are changing in the moment. The temperature is rising. You get different seasons. The length of the summer is changing, and so on. So no one can predict how the climate will be in 50 or 80 years. But when you plant a tree, you say, "I know this because I plant this tree, and it should be there around about, let's say, 80 years before it is harvested and go to the sawmill." And we say, no, let the ecosystem heal itself. And we are just looking how many timber we can take out without disturbing it too much. And that is much more careful. That doesn't mean that we have less timber from such forests, because the plantation forest, the hard plantation forest, not the ones you mean which should be reconstructed in Britain. When you would just have a spruce plantation, for example, those plantations are dying now. And the question is how such plantation forestry could deliver timber within the next 50 years. Because I think when we have another 10 years passing by, and we will see in Germany a big gap of timber, and forests, intact forests, resilient forests, healthy forests, they can deliver more timber. And we are also demanding bigger forests in Germany. We have one of the keys of climate change is meat. It's not coal and oil, it's meat. And in Germany, for example, we have 114,000 square kilometers of woodland, and we have 100,000 square kilometers just for animal food. And if we reduce the meat consumption, we can have bigger forests. And that, I think, that's one of the main keys.
And finally, Peter, what is your dream scenario?
My dream scenario would be when I'm sitting in a chair and at the age of 90 and looking back at my life, and I could say, wow, I would do it again. If I had to do it again, I would do it the same way.
Well, Peter, it's been an absolute privilege to speak to you, and I highly recommend The Heartbeat of Trees and all of your work, which I have read. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sharon. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
So what was the most fascinating thing you picked out of that?
The thing that really blew me away was the fact that this American vine copied the leaf shape of a plastic plant. And when they looked at leaves really carefully, they found this thin, clear film around the outside of leaves, really pointing to the fact that trees can see. So next time you go down to the woods, you are being watched. Wow!
Exactly. If you go down to the woods today, you might get a big surprise. And I tell you what, if trees can see, yeah, you might just want to kind of walk on through. So next week, going back to carbon forestry, aren't we? And it's probably worth noting that Noel didn't actually write Teddy Bear's Picnic.
We are. I mean, we had such a good response to our New Zealand episode. I wanted to dive into this further and see what's happening in the UK. I had a great conversation with Andrew Baker, who is the UK Woodland Carbon Markets Advisor for Scottish Forestry.
Okay, well, time to wrap it up again for another week. Thank you for listening, and don't forget, we will see you next time on Tree Lady Talks. In the meantime, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him. We haven't done a triangle for ages, Noel.
Dogs agree with that. Okay, I'll throw a triangle in. There you go.